All right. Thank you, Putra, for taking the time to talk with me this morning or this afternoon in Indonesia. I'm really happy to be sitting down with you for this interview. So maybe before we get started, you could take some time to introduce yourself, what you do, and who you are. And I really look forward to the next 10 to 15 minutes.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jimmy, and good to be connected. So my name is Putra. I'm a managing director for the Energy Shift Institute. We're a think tank that is working in energy finance. We're focusing on Southeast Asia and as well as East Asian dynamics of the energy transition. So there's me and my colleague as a co-managing director.
All right, sounds great. Sounds great. When you focus on the energy shift within Asia, what are your main focuses, and what's one of the things you would like to share with the world that people might not know about the Asian energy scene?
So what we'd like to bring is really a more inside out perspective, right? We notice that there is a lot of perspective coming from the outside to see how Southeast Asia should transition, but there's really not that many voice that is coming from within the region that analyze things as it go along, because the dynamics of the energy transition tend to move rapidly. There's a lot of political economy elements as well, and a lot of these sometimes gets lost when you view it from the outside. Hence we started the think tank on our own. Basically we want to have people on the ground who understand the dynamics, and then we can kind of analyze things more tactically from the perspectives.
Okay, you made a very good point there about things moving fast and being dynamic and hectic. When people think about Asia, they think that it's very populated, very big, that things are moving very fast, and it's a very fast-paced society in general. When you think about energy transition in Asia, though, maybe one of the questions we could start with is how do you see it going down in the next 10 to 15 years? What will be the major shifts and challenges, and what opportunities do you see as someone who has boots on the ground, who's looking at it from an inside perspective?
It will be an interesting times. I mean, obviously, Asia is such a big region. It contains so many different countries with vastly different economic backgrounds, histories, natural resources. So I think the next 10 years, it will be both an opportunity and a lot of challenges as well, right? Opportunities because there's a lot of technology adoptions that is driven by countries like China, as well as a lot of, supported by countries like Japan and so forth. On the other hand, there's a lot of emerging markets and emerging economies in Asia, including Southeast Asia, which means that balancing between development as well as the energy transition slash climate priorities is going to be a challenge, right? So therefore, it's going to be an interesting times. It's going to be a lot of balancing for all the actors on the ground. As well, it's going to be interesting to see how we can leverage what happens in China as some of the models that's going to transpire in other regions as well.
Okay, that is a very good point. I would like to focus on two things you mentioned. One of them is development and sustainability, and the other one is the focus on China. When we look at Europe in the early 20th century, we saw like rapid industrialization, which was mainly based on big factories that polluted the environment heavily, that polluted the water heavily, and then over time saw sustainability practices being implemented. And I'm just wondering, now that we know the best practices regarding sustainability, i.e., that you shouldn't dump toxic waste into the river, do you think that having the best practices in mind and building with that will ensure that going forward, Asia will have an industrialization that is more environmentally friendly and sustainable?
That's a very difficult question, frankly speaking. And I think that's actually what is going to be interesting within this space is that I think it's quite clear by now that the North-South model is going to be challenging, right? It's going to be challenging from people from Washington or London to be making an idea about this is how Southeast Asia or Asia should transition, right? So I think the ideas will develop a bit more in a more complicated landscape. I wouldn't say it's going to be ideal. I suppose there's a very high standard that the European Union has in place, right? To implement such a standard in countries in emerging market will be challenging. But what it often does is that it actually leaves a big open ground for investors with no standards whatsoever. So you have these two opposing forces, right? One that has very high standard and the other which has no standards. Now, so finding the balance between these two is going to be an interesting times, and it's going to be an interesting challenge because at the same time, China, a lot of its overseas development, has also been often touted as having a low standard of development, right? But I think now that is also changing slowly, is that I think we're starting to see some convergence. It's going to take time for countries to kind of chase into the high standards of the world, but I think it's going to be an interesting challenge.
Okay, that is an interesting point. When you think about that, though, I mean, obviously, culturally, both the European Union and countries in Southeast Asia are different. So, what works in Europe might not necessarily work in Asia. It takes a more nuanced approach in the region. And I'm just wondering, when you think about the nuances that would work in Asia as compared to Europe, what are the key differences you see? Like, how do you think will they implement the energy transition in the region?
Well, I think firstly, we still need to acknowledge that developments will always remain a priority for any government, right? I mean, obviously, everybody wants to talk and the good things about climate targets and whatsoever, but it's really finding that convergence point between development as well as transitioning into greener industries. And I do think that the big question for countries in emerging market like Southeast Asia is that how do you align your industrial development towards the future where major investors are asking clean energies, for example, where the value chain are basically start asking you about emission footprint and all these things, right? So I think that awareness is already growing, and I think it's really not about shutting out the door completely, but it's really about finding that balancing point while remain progressive. Now, one thing about this is that we do tend to see, just like in any other environmental topics, the discussion tend to be very polarized, right? On one end, you have people saying we need to shut down the coal power plant today, right? On the other, you will see, people who are working collaboratively, but are not being able to speak openly about many things. So I think that's where the role of independent thinkers and think tanks should be. They should remain independent, objective, as well as being progressive, right? It doesn't have to be that polarized. And I do think that in Southeast Asia, however, the level of sophistication and the strength of the think tank within our space is still quite limited. And I think that's going to be homework for us.
Yeah, yeah, I can imagine. You made a very good point there about energy transition and transitioning away from coal. Just to put that into context, China is the largest consumer of coal energy. Basically, they still heavily rely on coal, whereas in Europe and the rest of the world, major industries are shifting away from coal. So the focus now is on renewables such as solar, wind, and so on. And when people think about energy transition, that's like one of the things that comes to mind. Do you think these type of energy sources, renewables, also have a future within Asia? And how do you see the transition go from energy sources that are heavily pollutant, such as coal, to cleaner energy sources?
So firstly, the major growth of the renewables globally is actually centered around Asia, right? I mean, we have countries like China, Japan. A lot of people are not paying attention. Is actually one of the biggest solar adopter globally. India has some of the biggest solar power plants and whatnot, which tells you that the growth is really shifting from purely climate-driven model into an economic-driven model. Are there challenges? For sure. There's going to be need for grid upgrades and investment and so forth. So I think the future is still quite bright because the cost decline that we're seeing in renewables is just beginning. What countries in Southeast Asia is probably going to have some challenges is on at least two fronts. Number one is about securing the amount of financing and investment coming in, because obviously emerging market has a different cost of capital as compared to places like Europe and the United States and whatnot. And secondly, as well, there's a lot of dominance of state-owned enterprises, which means that within the power system, for example, some of these companies may have limited ability to invest in the power grid. So this is a bit different from the dynamics of the free market of the European Union and so forth. So I think those two challenges are there, but given the cost declines and the outlook, the growth potentials of industries within the region, I think the outlook is still bright.
Essentially, what I'm hearing out here, and feel free to correct me, is it's a question about investors coming into Asia and basically building renewable energy sources and investing into that. Would you agree with that?
Now, firstly, within many governments, there needs to be a convincing argument that energy transition is the way to go. And frankly speaking, this argument is still a mixed bag. Some people tend to believe it, others tend to see it more pragmatically, saying that coal is still going to be cheap. Now, let's put coal power, for example, right? Suppose you're a country somewhere in Southeast Asia, and then you can't find any funders to build a new coal power plant. But a lot of the government are still, hanging on to that hope, is that maybe we can build more fossil fuel power in the future. But the reality is that the world is already moving on. A lot of the people from the financial sector has already coal exclusion policy, which means that they're not willing to fund new coal powers. And gas scrutiny will slowly going to increase in the future as well. At the same time, you're seeing a lot of cost decline coming in from the renewable side. So that's a long winding way of me of saying is that there's a lot of people within the government that does not believe yet that there is a case for green economic growth. And I think that's the whole task for the, globally, is that to convince each other that when we say that there's going to be a green transition, that's actually going to be a transition that's going to be inclusive to build all the new green industries, whether in the West as well as in Asia. I think building that case is going to be important. So intertwining the topic about energy transition with economic growth is unavoidable. You cannot just say we want to do this because we want to reduce emissions. As much as we'd like to say that, it doesn't sell in many of the emerging markets, right? So you need to kind of intertwine those topics together.
You made a very good point about trying to sell it and convince and basically make the case for it. And I'm just wondering, when I think about campaigns here in Europe, I think about like the angle they take, which is like it's a long-term benefit, it's good for the environment, which also is good for the people, and it's good. It's basically for the collective good if we switch to renewables away from fossil fuels. What's the angle or the approach you take in Asia when you try to convince governments or individuals or stakeholders within government and finance that shifting to renewables is good? What do you try to convince them, and what do you try to show? What's the case you're trying to build?
So case number one is really try to show that investors demand clean energy, right, as part of their investment requirements. And I think this is the dynamics that we're seeing. A lot of countries are asking for high economic growth quality, right? When you want to high economic growth, obviously you will need investors that is of high quality. And if you list all those high investors, you'll definitely see them asking, I want a net zero target within the next 10, 20, 30 years and so forth, right? So that's point number one, building case for industries and investment that demand clean energy. Now, point number two, however, is about really convincing people that the door behind them oftentimes already been closed. This comes back to my point again about coal power financing, right? So today, there's almost near zero possibility for you to build new coal plants, especially if China and their overseas investment on coal power also subside as well, which means that the door behind many of these emerging markets has already been changing, which means that they need to move forward, whatever that way forward may be, right? And that can be many options. So at least those 2 points, right? Again, intertwining that high quality economic growth require high quality investors, and those people will require high quality energy source.
Awesome. Awesome. I just have one question at the end to round this up.
Sure.
When we talk about energy, renewables, environmental sustainability, and finance, there's basically, well, these days, there's basically no way around ESG. I think you're also familiar with ESG, and you just mentioned like high economic growth comes with high quality investors. And I'm just wondering, when we look at Asia as a whole, or like the region in general, and when we look at ESG challenges and opportunities over the next couple of years and the investors it will attract, what do you see there? What's basically something that would surprise investors, and what kind of opportunities does the region have for investors that are ESG conscious, that, want to only invest in sustainable and renewable sources and want to basically have ESG as their main focus?
Yeah, that's a very complicated question because you're combining two different words into one, ESGs and Asia, right? Those two complicated words into one makes it overly complicated. But let me try to get a stab on the question, right? Again, Asia is highly varied. When you're crossing borders between Japan, Singapore, and China, and Southeast Asia, all of these have vastly different colors, right? So when people ask, why is going to be a lot of potential in investing, for example, Asia? Obviously, it's the center of the whole population, right? You're going to have a lot of people moving, to the middle class. You're going to have a lot of demand growing within Asia, and at the same time, you're going to see the center of the clean technology, such as China, going to continue to push their product outwards. At the same time, what is interesting is that, especially with the dynamics we're seeing in the US, China is expanding outward, right? They're aware that some of their market will be eroded with the dynamics that's happening in the States, which means that they will need to build their value chain across many countries in Asia, as well as Africa and others as well. But again, coming back to that, this means that there's going to be more opportunities for investment, not just in the project itself, but also in the value chain. A lot of the emerging markets are highly sensitive on imported products. It means that if you're importing 100% of your solar cell coming from China, that's tolerable for the first few years, but not for the long term, right? Which means that if you're Pakistan, you want to build your own value chain, domestically, at least part of it. And the same argument goes for any other countries. So this, I think, is going to be a very interesting dynamics as well. The same thing goes for the auto sectors. Electric vehicle centers hub is coming from China, and they're spreading elsewhere like wildfire. So I think we're going to see a lot of interesting opportunities, charging stations and everything else. Now, obviously, there's a lot of China word in a lot of my sentence, but at the same time, many of these countries are also aware that balancing China and everybody else is going to be really important, right? No countries want to be solely reliant on China. So I think there's going to be a lot of balancing act that's happening across the regions.
All right, Putra, thank you very much for taking the time and sharing your insights with me. I appreciate it. I learned a lot of things here, and I'm very grateful for that. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me, Jimmy.